Pages of the Past. Sniper on the Eastern Front. The Memoirs of Sepp Allerberger. Chapter 5. More horrors on the road to Ingulez. On the 1st of March 1944, great waves of Russian foot soldiers streamed towards the German lines. Their determination on this occasion was of a special note. 3 GD shared the sector with 1 Puzesgren Div, and along this stretch the Soviets made up their losses in personnel daily, with endless marching columns of men arriving from deep in the interior. They lost 1,000 men per day, while our losses were nowhere near that figure. On the 3rd day, the Panzer Grenadiers were wiped out, and we had to plug the gap on the flank. By the 4th day, 3 GD had shrunk to half its starting numbers, 50% having fallen in the field or been wounded and unable to continue. Although right in the center of the fighting, I received no more than a few scratches. Once more, high morale and experience proved for some time that it could compensate for what was sadly lacking in numbers. But by the end of the 5th day, my battalion was reduced to 60. While we had been holding at bay an enemy attacking along 2 sides of the wedge, the sound of violent combat swelled up to our rear, and simultaneously a radio operator received a signal from Battalion HQ that they were under heavy attack and were asking for help. An enemy unit had infiltrated behind our lines and was attempting to eradicate our command center. 30 defenders were outnumbered 3-1. A violent engagement had begun, and the defenders were now low on ammunition. The battalion HQ structure was not intended as a fortification, and casualties were already serious. The main Russian attack on the front line was concentrated further down, so that the company commander decided to chance weakening the sector by releasing a couple of men to support the defense of Battalion HQ. This was agreed with other company commanders, who also detached a few men each. Soon the necessary battle-proven platoon had been assembled, 20 of us in all, including myself and a specially chosen observer. The report from Battalion HQ had arrived at about 8 in the morning. Barely an hour later, the relief platoon set off to cover the intervening 1,500 meters as quickly as possible, but with due caution, and in a quarter of an hour established contact with the enemy. Battalion HQ was set in a depression at the foot of an imposing hill, the terrain being in the main bushy upland. We did not have the strength to hold the hill, but for the Russians it was of strategic importance, since from the peak they could overlook the German positions. The defenders had withdrawn to the last remaining fortification and were almost out of ammunition. In response to the withering fire of the Russians, they replied with the occasional rifle round. The area surrounding Battalion HQ was strewn with the dead of both sides. We halted briefly to take stock. With my observer, I sought out some thick vegetation which appeared to offer excellent natural cover and a relatively good view of the proceedings. As the platoon settled in, waiting for the signal to attack, my observer sized up the Russian force. Through his binoculars, he had a very wide field of sight in comparison with that available to me through my telescopic sight, and this was bound to help me raise my score of kills significantly by precise indications of where to aim. I watched as an apparently dead German infantryman with a profusely bleeding head wound tried to push himself up with his hands and was immediately cut down by a burst of Russian MG fire. His head turned into a red mass under the rain of projectiles. "Small wall of earth, 10 meters right," my observer muttered. Moving my rifle, I soon had the Russian in the sight, aimed at his chest, squeezed the trigger, bang, dead. Perfect shot at 150 meters. This success was the signal to attack. The platoon opened fire. My own projectiles began to eat into the enemy numbers. The skirmish was short and violent. Caught in the unexpected crossfire of platoon and sniper, and horrified by their escalating losses, the Russians lost their heads. Shooting wildly in all directions, they withdrew in disorder. 20 made it into the undergrowth. They left 80 dead and wounded behind. There was no time for anything more, After a short discussion with the battalion HQ survivors, we headed once again for the front. 20 minutes later, we were in our own trenches. The battle raged for 6 days, almost without pause. Towards its conclusion, we were so exhausted that it was easy to fall into a coma-like sleep during the shortest period of inactivity. The medics made regular distributions of Pervitin to keep us alert. 3. GD held its positions until the 7th of March 1944, even though the Soviets crossed the Ingulez River the previous day and dynamited parts of the front line. The division became a thorn in their side. To remove us, the usual infantry solution was adopted once more. GJR 144 was at the heart of this pressure. When it got too hot for us, we fell back on the regimental HQ and fought there. The command structure had ceased to function. Each group fought for itself and to survive. During this utter confusion, the order came to retreat across the Ingulez forthwith. This was easier said than done. The Russians had more or less succeeded in isolating 3 GD. Its line of supply no longer existed, and the main field hospital was in Soviet hands. All that remained was a defended corridor about 1 kilometer in width through which the retreat had to be funneled. These were the circumstances under which the few fighting fit survivors and walking wounded of GJR 144 embarked upon their withdrawal, their numbers swollen from time to time by remnants from other units. Some of the latter included 4 medics who had fled the Russian assault on the main field hospital. The men were in a highly agitated state and appeared close to mental breakdown, a sign of some terrible experience. A sergeant who asked of them the whys and wherefores received such irrational garble in reply that he shrugged his shoulders in bemusement and passed them to the dressing station with orders that they should be given a meal and a shot of rum. This did the trick, and after a while they were sufficiently calm to be able to deliver an account of their chilling ordeal. We shrank in horror at what they had to tell us, and heightened our will to resist Russian captivity. Not all the wounded had been allocated a berth on the ill-fated last ambulance train out of the partial encirclement. The hopeless cases had been left behind at the main field hospital under the care of a doctor and 7 medics. In order to indicate that the area was hors de combat, it had been staked out with Red Cross and white flags, and all weapons placed in the open. It was a Mongolian unit that captured the field hospital. After moving warily from tent to tent, they surrounded the area and called upon the fascist swine inside to come out with their hands raised. The Mongols approached the medical staff nervously, weapons at the ready. 2 medics emerged from the surgical operation tent. They had learnt off by heart a few sentences from a Russian phrase book for soldiers on the Eastern Front and said, "We are unarmed, here only wounded. We surrender to the Soviet army." Hands above the head, the 2 medics, trembling with fear, awaited the confrontation with the Asiatic soldiers. The first came up to them and issued an order that was not understood. Immediately, the Mongol rammed the stock of his machine pistol into the face of the medic, breaking his nose. Blood coursed swiftly from between his fingers, which were covering the injury to his mouth. He collapsed to the ground. The Mongol took a step back and fired a burst from his weapon into the upper torso of the injured man. At that moment, the surgeon, still wearing a blood-smeared apron, emerged from the operating tent together with an assistant to find out what was going on. 4 other Russians arrived, attracted by the commotion, and forced the 3 Germans back into the operating tent at gunpoint, screaming a series of incomprehensible orders. On the operating table lay a soldier with severe head wounds, which were being bandaged by a 4th medic. One of the Russians pushed past, drew a knife from its scabbard on his belt and drove it into the heart of the patient through his ribcage, turned it 2 or 3 times before withdrawal, and made the observation, "This fascist pig is no longer required." The Germans looked on with shock, realizing full well what danger they now found themselves in. They were forced into an adjoining tent in which the other seriously wounded had been prepared for surgery. A Mongol sergeant pushed the surgeon aside as he pleaded with the Soviet to spare the wounded. The sergeant said, "Now we will show you what happens to people who invade Mother Russia and kill women and children." With a gesture to a subordinate, he indicated to the wounded men and said, "Cut their throats like sheep." Wherever these people came from, they must have been expert sheep farmers and slaughterers, for they drew knives, honed to a fine sharpness, from inside their boots, and set about the task in hand with great dexterity. Without the least sign of emotion or excitement, they raised each head and made a deep incision across the throat. The Mongols worked swiftly and expertly, and in a few minutes the operating theater had been transformed into a human slaughterhouse. The majority did not die instantly, but bled to death where they lay. The surgeon, who confronted every day the ugliness of war, blanched and collapsed to his knees. "Weakling," the Mongol sergeant said, smashing the stock of his machine pistol in the surgeon's face. Adding, "You pig, suck my boots." He raised the weapon by the barrel and brought it down with full force on the German's skull. 3 similar blows followed to ensure death. The medics were frozen in horror in one corner of the tent. The Mongol pulled one of them to him and wiped the blood-smeared butt of the MP on his uniform. Since there were no wounded left alive in the hospital, it now occurred to the Russians to loot it. The 6 surviving medics were forced to sit in front of the operation tent with arms covering their heads, guarded by a single Mongol soldier, whose irritation at being excluded from the plunder was fairly evident. "Shit, damn. Why have I got to stay here and look after these stupid pigs? Can I just shoot them?" he asked the sergeant. "Shut your mouth and do what I told you," the sergeant retorted. "The old man wants to have a word with them. Perhaps we can make them sing and tell us where their heroic comrades have hidden supplies." One of the German medics understood Russian. "They are going to finish us off like they did with the wounded," he whispered. "We've had it in any case. At the next opportunity, I suggest we make a fight of it and run. Our people can't be too far away." His comrade nodded. "Okay, I'll kill the Ivan, then we'll run through the operation tent, jump over the amputations trench, and then dive into the bushes. We'll keep running until we're safe. Each man looks out for himself, but tries to keep contact with the others." The Russians could be heard admiring their booty in loud tones, especially when they found the food store. The Mongol sentry was by now in a passioned torment and had begun to make urgent requests to his comrades to set aside his share. This was the opportunity. The Russians were rummaging through crates and boxes. The sentry watched them in annoyance and was derelict in his task. In a lightning movement, the medic drew a knife from his boot, sprang for his man like a tiger, grabbed the steel helmet by the forward rim, yanked it back into his neck, and, throttling the man with the chin strap, removed him from view of his comrades. A second later, with expert anatomical knowledge, the knife went into his right kidney where it was turned in the wound 3 times for maximum effect. The Russian froze with the sudden, terrible pain. The medic suppressed the man's groans by placing a hand over his mouth while lowering him to the ground. To finish the job, he should have cut the sentry's throat. His omission was to cost 2 more German lives, including his own. The German medics now darted through the long tent. They had not quite reached the far end when the death croak of the Mongol sentry reached the ears of his comrades. Several sprays of MP fire tore through the sailcloth of the tent. The last medic, bloody knife still in his hand, was hit and fell. The others kept running, leapt the open amputations trench, but the 5th caught his foot in a tent line and fell into the trench, stacked high with arms and legs. The 4th had made it to the other side, hesitated, and reached his hand towards the 5th man. As the latter rose, a burst of MP fire caught him in the back. The 4 survivors made the adjacent bushes and escaped. The hail of bullets fired into the thick vegetation all missed. Veterans always carried with them a small hand compass, and one of the medics had one, which saved their lives. It took them 2 days to hunt down the retreating German forces and elude the enemy. After reporting the names of the dead to the commanding officer, they took their place within the marching column, alone with the memory of their recent harrowing experience. We had not eaten for days. We were filthy, flea-ridden, and at the end of our physical endurance. Arriving at the new battle line, we received a briefing. The division was all but out of small arms ammunition. Everybody had to consider very carefully whether he needed to fire at any particular moment. Only the strictest self-discipline and composure would see us through in the coming battles. The alternative was the certainty that the front would crumble, and that meant death in Russian captivity. The private soldier needed to know no more. The German front line had developed into a bulge, which the Soviets were proposing to tie off rather like a sack. German Six-Dot Army commanders were engaged in a last-ditch effort to stave off the threatened encirclement. However, had it not been for the lack of coordination between the various Russian armies, the pincer movement could not have been stopped. 15 German divisions were now concentrated into a wedge. Their purpose was to break out, cross the Ingulez River, keep going for the Bug River, cross to the west bank, and dig in. 3. GD had been chosen to spearhead this operation. It was first to the Ingulez and found a suitable crossing point. A battalion of sappers installed a portable dam while Soviet attacks were disjointed and easily withstood. Meanwhile, advance units of GJR 138 and 144 occupied bridgeheads to secure the crossing and fight off any enemy response. On the 15th of March, 1944, heavy rains preceded strong winds with violent hail and later a blizzard. Without proper shelter and lacking any hope of medical treatment, the advance guard huddled together in their holes in the ground, feverish and shivering. It was in low spirits that our motley unit plodded towards the bridgehead alongside columns of 3 GD vehicles. The size of the evacuation lent a feeling of security. At the approach to the Ingulez, I saw through intense hail the 2 regimental commanders in discussion with their staffs about how to defend the crossing point. I was approaching to report my presence when, while still about 30 meters away, there came a warning shout, "Achtung, Ivan, tank." At that moment, a T-34 became dimly visible and opened fire with its MGs. A horse was hit and began to whinny pitifully while our troops dispersed and sprinted for cover. An SP gun attempted to maneuver into position to return fire. The horse was the personal mount of Oberst Graf von der Goltz, Regimental Commander GJR 138. The animal had a gaping wound in the hindquarters. Instead of seeking cover, the Oberst went to his horse. Some of the regimental staff officers had thrown themselves to the ground as the tank turret swiveled to take them under fire. Flames leapt from the muzzle of the beast's main gun, and the shell, narrowly missing the prostrate officers, turned a group of vehicles into a heap of twisted and burning metal. Metal splinters hummed and whistled through the air. The belly of the horse was ripped wide open. The Oberst fell as if hit by an unseen iron fist. The German SP gun fired at the tank and hit the turret. There was a dull explosion and the T-34 burst into flame. The occupants were probably fried, for they made no attempt to escape. Within minutes, the danger had passed. I saw the Oberst struggle to his feet. His right arm was gone, except for a jagged piece of bone jutting from the socket. Dumbstruck and in panic, he stared at the injury for a few seconds before collapsing unconscious. Then help came running. For me, it was simply another episode in everyday life, but for the division, it was a serious loss. Von der Goltz had been an outstandingly competent leader of men and personally brave. An unconventional officer who throughout his career had been continually at odds with his superiors. With the Gebirgsjäger, he had finally discovered the kind of leadership he could live with, and the opportunity to develop his abilities to the full. He was also the only 3 GD commander who wore the oak leaves. After a few days, I learned that the Oberst had died of gangrene in a military hospital at Odessa. On the 16th of March, 1944, the Russians intensified their pressure on the bridgeheads held by GJR 138 and 144. The fighting was hectic, but the defenders held out. 3. GD was one of the last divisions across the Ingulez, the tail of the withdrawal being covered by a small rearguard. Here, the sniper could come into his own, holding reconnaissance platoons and infantry battle units at a suitable distance while obtaining valuable information about the enemy. During this stage of the retreat to the Bug River, our divisions were very vulnerable, and it was essential to keep the enemy undecided as to our true intentions for as long as possible. The purpose of the rearguard was to offer delaying tactics until the bulk of the main force had reached its new position. To deliberately remain in contact with the enemy, to influence his decisions and movements in this manner required a great deal of discipline and heart, and only the veteran MG gunner or sniper could be relied upon for the kind of precision work required. Without doubt, the sniper provided the most effective form of rearguard. In his disguised hide, he awaited the cautiously advancing enemy unit, observed its strength and equipment, and then forced it to ground with 2 or 3 rounds of rapid, accurate fire bearing the hallmark of the sniper. This was often sufficient to stop advancing infantry in their tracks for hours at a time. During the Ingulez retreat, the German units moved out at night. I remained behind in one of several carefully prepared positions that were not only well hidden, but provided some security against the effects of shelling. The important thing was that they should offer me the opportunity to make a fast escape unseen. If possible, I looked for suitable places in no man's land so that our own trenches and foxholes were included in my general scheme. When I abandoned the area, I left behind booby traps made of hand grenades and tripwires. Here, the idea was to sow confusion among the enemy during his advance, forcing him to withdraw or present me with a couple of inviting targets for effect. The sport of resistance and withdrawal went on for 4 days. Each day I noticed how the Russians had become a little more cautious. In the end, I would only manage 1 or 2 successful hits daily, for most of them went to earth and stayed there. They became expert at using cover, their preoccupation being to assume total invisibility. My first opportunity for a precise shot had been about 100 meters from my hide, probably an observer who had settled behind some bushes, but betrayed his position by moving incautiously. I noticed the unnatural movement of the leaves and, on scrutiny through the telescopic sight, made out his silhouette. I aimed at its center. The hectic trembling of the bush twigs confirmed a hit. I waited on tenterhooks to see what the Russians did next. Nothing. All quiet on the Ingulez front. After an hour, I became jittery. Something was not right here. Intently, I surveyed no man's land through binoculars, but found no sign of life. My muscles ached, and I felt the need for a stretch and crossed my legs. I had just laid my right foot on the left heel when I heard a rifle shot from the Russian side and felt a heavy blow to my right heel. I curled up instinctively deep in my foxhole to examine my painful injury. The entire heel had been shot off the boot, and a trail of blood was oozing over the sole. I recognized at once the handiwork of a sniper, and he must have been the best, both by his observation work and marksmanship. It had been a masterly shot. Now, my own thought was survival. Since my hide had been identified, I could not afford to reveal an inch of myself, and remained low. For the moment, it seemed that the Russian was uncertain. He had no knowledge about the effect of his bullet, and so we had a standoff. Nobody on the Soviet side was prepared to risk showing himself, and my closest examination of the terrain revealed no trace of my opponent. My hope was that the latter would lie low until the fall of darkness, when I could withdraw unseen. The hours dragged until eventually the onset of night freed me from the trap. I found the exit path I had marked towards the neighboring company sector. Next day, I remained particularly alert, but luckily my path did not again cross that of my Russian counterpart. A couple of days later, the rearguard reached the Bug River and crossed to the west bank unseen. Our installations on the riverbank were solid and of good quality, having been set up 2 years earlier during the days of our eastward advance, and little extra work had been required to make them comfortable. Meanwhile, the Russians surprised us by leaving us entirely to our own devices, and we spent a whole week not only recuperating, but rearming and re-equipping. Even some reserves came up. It was like being on holiday. We slept 8 hours per day, had regular meals and the occasional shower. But the idyll was short-lived. On the night of the 26th of March, 1944, using the cover of darkness, Russian assault troops crossed the Bug unobserved and set up a bridgehead below the cliff where Battalion 2-144 was quartered. At first light, the band of toughened veterans stole into the trenches and overcame the sentries with knives and sharpened entrenching tools. No shots were fired, no prisoners taken. The day was saved by an alert MG gunner. Observing the opposite bank 200 meters away through binoculars, he noticed a kind of raft or float being let down into the water and quickly checked the German positions. Glimpsing for a fraction of a second the tops of 2 Russian helmets above the trench parapet, he raised the alarm. Shooting broke out, MP's stuttered cries were heard. The Russian raid had been detected at last, and violent hand-to-hand fighting started in the trenches. In seconds, the German defenders were wide awake, armed and manning their positions. The Soviets had embarked upon an amphibious crossing of the Bug, mindless of the murderous defensive fire. Since they had neglected to bring up a single artillery piece to cover them, relying entirely on the element of surprise, we held all the trumps and the invasion from the river was soon in serious difficulties. However, a dangerous situation was developing in the trenches, which we had begun to lose piecemeal section by section. A group had been formed to repulse the infiltration, and this had been partially successful, but the Russians were hanging on to what they had captured, as if their lives depended on it. I was picking off Russians in the boats one by one when an NCO, watching the fighting in the trenches through field glasses, drew my attention to a soldier wearing a white fur cap, apparently the group commander, who was continually seen in the midst of the fighting and seemed to be animating the fierce Russian resistance. "I think the fine fur cap over there is the leader. If you can knock him out, our people can finish the rest off." I knew how an officer leading his men in the thick of things could motivate people to fight, and the demoralizing effect when he fell. With a couple of strides, I reached a bend in the trench complex from where I had a good field of fire and a place to rest my rifle. With regard to the importance of the task in hand, I decided to expend one of my precious explosive rounds. These were found only rarely in captured ammunition. I prepared the weapon and awaited my chance for the fatal shot. The NCO was my observer, watching the opposite trench through his binoculars. Suddenly, the fur cap appeared above the trench parapet. "There, Sepp, to the right," the NCO yelled. I swung the weapon, but the target had already disappeared. "Sepp, he's making to the right. Wait a bit, and you'll see the cap appear above the trench." I had worked out the rhythm of my opponent. He would soon pass across the sapper's entrance, giving me a split second to shoot him. I aimed the crosswires of the sight on the entrance at head height and awaited the decisive moment. Suddenly, 120 meters distant, the target head filled the sight. My shot rang out and hit. Through our respective optics, the NCO and I saw the white fur cap swell like a balloon, then burst like an overripe watermelon. Deprived of their commander, the Russians appeared at once confused and disoriented. Our own assault force used the opportunity to storm the occupied trenches. In the ensuing fighting, the veteran invaders were wiped out to the last man. I returned my attentions to the riverborne invasion force immediately, and my observer had taken up his carbine. The value of the sniper lies in his ability to distribute a rapid and very accurate fire. The infantry aboard the boats and floats, recognizing that they posed an easy target from the shore, had disembarked very early from the craft in the effort to escape the withering fire. Firing at the heads in the water was just target practice for the sniper. The Russians gave no heed to casualties, and the water was red with their blood, rather like the waste drain at a slaughterhouse. A bloody broth of corpses, limbs, and internal body organs drifted gently down the stream towards the Black Sea. A neighboring sector of the line was captured by the Soviets, but despite the exposed flank, GJR 144 repelled everything the Russians could throw at it and held its trenches until the 27th of March 1944, when 3 GD was ordered to retire to the Dniester, 300 kilometers to the southwest. This involved a 48-hour enforced march to get clear of the area, but the Russians were wise to it, having learnt their First World War lessons well, and kept on our heels. To add to our problems, the supply line had been severed, and we received no ammunition, provisions, and worst of all, no anti-tank weapons. The last lorry to get through brought 2 tons of bitter chocolate and 500 iron crosses. This kind of administrative lunacy drove us to despair. The daily fare was now half a bar of bitter chocolate and a ship's biscuit, rich in ballast and very good for those vulnerable to loose motions. The 2 days' forced march failed to bring about the hoped-for respite. The Russians maintained their stranglehold on the division, and the retreat soon degenerated into an ugly free-for-all without well-drawn battle lines. The Soviets were everywhere, creating islands of German resistance that had no option but to fight on alone in the hope of regaining contact later with the main group. The Russian infantry had a new battlefield vehicle, armored half-tracks for infantry transport supplied under the terms of the U.S. Lend-Lease Pact. These machines were obviously very useful for getting Russian soldiers into and behind our lines, where they would disembark and immediately start fighting. The danger could be averted with anti-tank guns, but we had nothing more powerful than hand grenades to do the job. With a rumble of motor and a clanking of tread, the half-tracks made for our positions. With no time to spare, we discussed quickly how we were to combat this new peril, since hand grenades seemed so unpromising a solution. Through field glasses, I examined the approaching vehicles for a weak point. The front was armor-plated with the driver located in a wheelhouse, vision being afforded by a viewing slit 30 x 10 centimeters in size. In my estimation, the chance of a hit with a rifle shot was not good, but was probably the only way to stop the vehicle. I took careful note of the intervening terrain for likely course changes. The half-track was moving at walking pace. I loaded 1 explosive round and rolled a tent into a rest for the rifle barrel, aimed the weapon, and watched the approach for my chance. Taking calm, measured breaths, I got the viewing slit in the cross wires and took up some pressure on the trigger. The machine was about 60 meters off when, for a brief moment, I saw the eyes of the driver through the viewing slit, possibly judging the ground ahead. I fired. A hit. At once, the vehicle slewed and rutted sideways into a shell crater, the tracks continuing to turn and ensuring that it got well and truly stuck. The incumbent Russian soldiers abandoned the useless conveyance in panic and, being met at once by heavy fire from our riflemen, were forced back into the crater for protection. It appeared that the driver's cabin was partitioned off from the passenger area, making it impossible to relieve him at the controls in an emergency. I had found the Achilles heel, and hopes grew that this might be the answer. Using my last 20 explosive rounds, I managed to kill or wound 7 of the 12 half-track drivers that day. The other 5 got through our lines to unload their human freight, but the latter was not quality material, and none lived to tell the tale. Although I had been successful, neighboring divisions were breached at many points, forcing us to pull back yet again to an organized defensive line. To our astonishment, OKH sent to our aid a number of Romanian bomber aircraft and an anti-tank detachment. They destroyed 24 Russian tanks and gave us the breathing space needed to construct a new defensive line. After fighting for months without air support, the sight of friendly aircraft seemed almost surreal. Nevertheless, the regiment remained under severe pressure. Although the line held, we lost a third of our fighting personnel. Eventually, the Soviets gave it up and switched their effort to a much weaker sector a few kilometers further on. A unit composed mainly of youngsters fresh from basic training was wiped out. In the uncanny silence, the men of GJR 144 grabbed a few hours' desperately needed sleep.